Well, that's right. The leaders of this team say what they've found is very exciting and very convincing.
They vanished without a trace. 115 men, women, and children gone. No bodies, no graves, only a single word carved into a tree. Croatan. A secret token, he called it, left behind as a sign. Here it was, Croatan etched into the post. It seemed to explain everything. But it explained nothing. For centuries, the disappearance of the Roanoke Colony remained America's most chilling enigma. One of its oldest unsolved mysteries, and it happened right in our own backyard. Now, in 2025, scientists have broken the silence. What they uncovered isn't just shocking, it's terrifying. It began in the blistering summer of 1587. Under the searing Atlantic sun, 3 English ships slid into the shallows and anchored off Roanoke Island, a remote, wild spit of land off what is now the coast of North Carolina. Aboard were 115 souls. Not conquerors, but dreamers. They stepped onto the soil of a new world, carrying the fragile hope of a new beginning. They weren't the first to try. 2 earlier expeditions had failed, ruined by violence, starvation, and chaos. But this time felt different. Led by the thoughtful and determined John White, they came with families, not fighters. They came to stay. Among them was a symbol of hope, Virginia Dare, White's granddaughter, the first English child born on American soil. Her birth was more than a joy, it was a statement. England had arrived to stay. They worked beneath towering pines and oaks, raising a modest wooden fort, planting crops and forming cautious ties with native tribes. The land was raw, beautiful, and merciless. Still, they endured. Then, just as their lives began to take root, White returned to England for more supplies, and when he came back, nothing remained. A voyage he expected would take only a few months stretched into years. Europe was on fire, England was locked in a deadly standoff with Spain, and Queen Elizabeth I had seized every seaworthy vessel to fight the looming threat of the Spanish Armada. John White was trapped. 3 long years powerless, watching the days bleed away while imagining what horrors might be unfolding across the ocean. When he finally returned to Roanoke in August of 1590, the silence struck first. The harbor was still, the air thick and unnatural. The fort stood exactly as he had left it, palisades upright, gates unbroken, structures intact. But not a soul remained, no laughter, no voices, no smoke curling from the chimneys. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath, refusing to speak. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no scattered belongings, no hastily dug graves or bones left to time. Just one word, carved deep into the entrance post, Croatoan, and nearby 3 unfinished letters. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, home to an allied indigenous tribe. It was also the agreed-upon signal, the place they would carve if forced to move. There was no cross, no distress symbol. Perhaps, White thought, they had left willingly. Perhaps they were alive. But fate turned against him. As he prepared to sail to Croatoan, a violent storm erupted. His ship's anchor snapped. Supplies ran low. His crew, cold and defeated, refused to press on. With a shattered heart, White abandoned the search and returned to England, never to see the New World again. His journal is all that remains, trembling with restrained panic and hollow regret. It wasn't what he saw that haunted him, it was what he failed to do. And because of that, an entire colony, a seed of England, vanished without a trace. In the centuries that followed, Roanoke became a riddle. Historians dug, theorists obsessed. Settlers reported tribes whose members had gray eyes, spoke broken English, and claimed descent from white ancestors. Some had lighter features, hair and bone structure that didn't match the native lineage. There were even rumors of hand-drawn maps showing distant villages with English-style buildings, perfectly aligned, too precise to be native-made. But every clue dissolved into shadow. Every lead ended in ash. In time, darker theories emerged. Some believed the colonists had been slaughtered by nearby tribes after fragile diplomacy collapsed. Others whispered of starvation, madness, or even cannibalism driven by a brutal winter. A few pointed toward the Spanish, who patrolled the Atlantic seaboard in secret, erasing rival settlements without a trace. Then came tales of curses, of sacred burial grounds disturbed, of land that rejected the settlers despite no clear answers. The search never stopped. Excavations and studies pressed on. Archaeologists scoured Roanoke and its surrounding regions, unearthing fragments of pottery, rusted weapons, and beads, artifacts that could have belonged to the colonists or could have come from anywhere. The line between truth and legend grew razor thin. Just like the Dare Stone, a relic said to carry the voice of Eleanor White Dare. In 1937, it surfaced, a carved rock bearing a desperate message from Eleanor, mother of Virginia Dare. It spoke of disease, death, and unbearable grief. The nation was spellbound. Then came more stones. Too many. Eventually, scholars dismissed most as forgeries, if not all. Hope crumbled once again into doubt. Yet Roanoke refused to fade. It haunted the American imagination, a mystery with just enough evidence to provoke belief and just enough silence to breed legend. Centuries passed. Technology surged ahead. DNA tests were proposed. LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar swept across the Carolina coast. Still, nothing. An entire community had vanished into the trees, and all they left behind were questions. Then came the map. Like many great discoveries, it started small. In 2012, a researcher at the British Museum was studying a faded 16th century watercolor titled La Virginia Pars, created by none other than John White. The map, delicate and centuries old, had long been a focus of scholarly curiosity, but that day something odd stood out. A barely noticeable patch, subtle enough to miss unless you knew exactly where to look. Using backlighting, an old technique meant to reveal hidden sketches and erased marks, the researcher uncovered it, the outline of a square-shaped fort, faint but deliberate, concealed beneath the surface. Hidden beneath the patch near the meeting point of the Roanoke and Chowan rivers, the mark had been made with invisible ink or iron gall, its secrets preserved by time and chance. What made this discovery so extraordinary wasn't just the hidden nature of the marking. It was where it was found, exactly 50 miles west of Roanoke Island. That distance wasn't random. It matched a cryptic note buried in John White's own journal, written before his fateful return to England in 1587. In it, he recorded that the Roanoke colonists, who would later disappear without a trace, had planned to move 50 miles into the Main. Long overlooked, that phrase suddenly held new weight. Why had White concealed this fort? Theories erupted. Some believed he meant to shield its location from Spanish spies who prowled the New World to sabotage English settlements. Others whispered that White never returned, not because he couldn't, but because he feared what he might find: failure, disease, or something worse. The map, once just a sun-faded artifact, had become a cipher in America's oldest mystery. The find ignited the archaeological world. Soon after, the First Colony Foundation, a North Carolina-based group dedicated to solving the Roanoke mystery, launched a full investigation. Under the leadership of renowned archaeologist Nick Licchetti, they focused on the area around the Albemarle Sound in Bertie County. This new site was given a name that reflected both caution and hope: Site X. Site X and the Ghosts of Bertie. Excavations began with high expectations, but also skepticism. The landscape was thick with pine and tangled brush, far from the classic image of an English fort. As the dig grew, no walls emerged, no trenches, no barracks, nothing that clearly said fort. Then, just beyond the edge of an abandoned native village called Metaquem, the soil began to whisper. Layer by layer, it yielded clues. Fragments of English pottery buried beneath centuries of earth. These weren't decorative or trade goods, they were functional. Bowls, jars, cooking pots. Many bore the greenish glaze typical of Surrey, Hampshire wares from Elizabethan England. And one detail stood out more than any other. There were no clay tobacco pipe. The settlers of Jamestown, founded in 1607, famously left pipe fragments everywhere. But the Roanoke colonists came earlier, before that trend. The absence wasn't a mistake, it was a timestamp. These pieces weren't left by chance. They suggested not just presence, but habitation. Someone had lived here, cooked here, stored food here. As interest mounted, the team expanded their search with ground-penetrating radar. Just 2 miles away, the soil revealed something else. Site Y. This time, the artifacts widened in scope. Fragments of European ceramics from multiple regions, hinting at a merging of cultures. Quiet, buried evidence that the lost colony may not have vanished but transformed. This opened the door to a possibility few had dared to explore in depth, a theory both radical and quietly logical. A new narrative began to form in the minds of researchers, one not of a single lost colony, but of dispersal. What if the colonists hadn't vanished but splintered, an intentional, desperate effort to survive? Some may have blended into native tribes like the Croatan. Others could have pushed deeper into the wilderness, forging secret settlements under the watch of sympathetic tribal leaders. Site X and Site Y, divided by a sliver of forest and 4 centuries of silence, began to suggest something profound. This was not a story of sudden failure, but of quiet fragmentation. Not disappearance, but transformation. And the deeper they dug, the more it appeared that Roanoke's fate was not a single moment lost in time, but a mosaic of choices, survival, and endurance. Yet this was only one side of the mystery. While Site X captivated the headlines with its tantalizing clues, another excavation unfolded over 200 miles southeast on the salt-stung shores of Hatteras Island, once known as Croatan. Long whispered in legend as the true resting place of the colonists, the island was finally offering proof, buried beneath centuries of coastal sand. At the center was British archaeologist Mark Horton, working alongside the Croatan Archaeological Society, led by local native Scott Dawson. Where Site X hinted at relocation, the Hatteras dig revealed a narrative of assimilation. Among the shifting dunes, they unearthed artifacts that bore the unmistakable touch of English hands, a rusted rapier hilt, corroded firearm fragments, and most remarkably, a slate writing tablet still etched with faint English script. These were not trade goods or discarded debris. These were lived-in items, deliberate, functional, human. Someone had not merely passed through, they had stayed. Even more compelling were the oral traditions carried by the Lumbee and other native communities. For generations, they told of white settlers who joined the Croatan, married, raised families, and lived as one. These stories had long been dismissed by scholars as myth or romantic fantasy, but now, for the first time, the artifacts echoed the voices of the past. Scott Dawson's 2020 book, The Lost Colony and Hatteras Island, documented these findings, presenting a bold argument. The colony didn't disappear, it fractured. Some may have fled west toward Site X, but others, perhaps more than anyone had guessed, had become part of Croatan itself. They were never lost, they were hidden in plain sight, camouflaged by time and history's neglect. And this raised an even more audacious possibility. What if both stories were true? What if Roanoke didn't collapse, but evolved? To explore this theory, researchers had to move beyond shovels and trowels. The investigation entered a new phase, one of science, technology, and forensic history. Ground-penetrating radar scanned beneath the soil, locating anomalies without disturbing sacred ground. LiDAR peeled back layers of forest digitally, exposing lost structures and ancient changes to the land, once thought empty. These tools uncovered the shapes of old hearths, fence lines, post holes, silent evidence of long-term habitation. But the most haunting clues came from the artifacts themselves. Researchers began comparing pottery shards, tools, and remnants from sites X, Y, and Hatteras, searching for connections, patterns, and inconsistency. Each shard, each fragment whispered the same chilling question. What if the colony was never lost, just forgotten? What they uncovered turned the entire timeline on its head. Unlike Jamestown or Plymouth, where clay tobacco pipes and post-1600 European ceramics are common, none of those markers appeared at the Roanoke-associated sites. Instead, the artifacts matched a pre-1600 English presence, exactly when the Roanoke settlers disappeared. It meant one thing: these weren't relics of later colonial movement. They were from the Roanoke colonists themselves. Then came the real shock: DNA analysis. Within the genetic code of local indigenous communities, scientists began to find markers consistent with Western European ancestry, centuries old, not from later colonization, but far older, aligned with the fateful year of 1587. At first, researchers whispered it, then louder. If this was true, the story of Jamestown in 1607, of Plymouth in 1620, and of the Mayflower wasn't the beginning at all. The first chapter had already been written by people history declared dead. But they didn't die, they lived, adapted, and were forgotten. Yet not everyone agreed. For every new clue pulled from North Carolina's red soil, a fresh wave of skepticism followed. The lost colony wasn't just a historical puzzle, it was an ideological battlefield. Believers pointed to coherent evidence, skeptics saw only coincidence. Veteran archaeologist Dr. Charles Ewan warned against confirmation bias, accusing researchers of chasing belief instead of truth. "They're trying to prove a theory," he said in 2019, "not disprove it. That's dangerous for science." Scott Dawson, a Croatan native and historian, saw it differently. His family had lived on Hatteras Island for generations. To him, the colonists' fate was never in doubt. They went to Croatan, he insisted, not inland into hostile territory, but to the nearby island of Allies. He dismissed Site X as implausible, too far, too dangerous, surrounded by enemies. It would have been suicide. Even within the First Colony Foundation, the group spearheading the search, consensus fractured. One faction backed the split colony theory. Some settlers joined coastal tribes, others moved inland. Another faction rejected the inland idea entirely, arguing that any European artifacts found there might belong to earlier exploratory missions. But the artifacts told a more ambiguous story: a silver ring with a lion crest, a European rapier hilt, fragments of pottery chemically matched to 16th century English kilns. Enough to tempt, not enough to confirm. Still, new tools brought new hope: ground-penetrating radar, drone-assisted mapping, mitochondrial DNA analysis, radiocarbon dating grew more exact, soil analysis grew more refined, and artifact by artifact the evidence piled up, quietly, steadily, like whispers refusing to die. Then, in 2025, the whispers became a roar. The dig site looked ordinary, a patch of land by the Chowan River near elusive Site X. It was a cold February morning, and the First Colony Foundation team expected little until they found her. The burial was unmistakably Christian. Supine position, head west, feet east, the symbolic alignment to face the rising sun on Resurrection Day. No grave goods, no decorations, just bones, weathered but whole. And when the DNA results returned, they hit like a thunderclap. She was of European descent, and she was female. That changed everything. She ruled out the all-male 1585 expedition. She wasn't from Jamestown. They arrived years later and had never reached this far inland. This woman didn't pass through. She lived and died there, which meant others had too. For centuries, the lost colony conjured images of settlers vanishing into the wilderness. But now a single grave rewrote that story. "This is terrifying," one archaeologist whispered, "not because we found her, but because now we know others were there too." The colonists hadn't vanished. They hadn't been slaughtered in one tragic event. They had splintered, moved, survived. Now two destinations emerged from the data, and two very different fates. The mounting evidence pointed to a split migration. Some colonists, perhaps the desperate or practical, headed southeast to Hatteras Island, home of the Croatan. There they may have found uneasy sanctuary, English tools, European pottery, genetic links in native descendants, all supported the theory. The Croatan, known for their openness, may have taken them in. But it wasn't ambition that drove the settlers. It was surrender, quiet, necessary, and full of cultural cost. Others ventured inland, toward the forests of Metaquum. Why? Perhaps for autonomy, perhaps to disappear. In the deep woods they escaped would-be rescuers and history itself. Their reasons weren't strategic, they were survival. Drought turned crops to dust, disease spread unchecked, starvation gnawed at reason. Add to that the threat of tribal or Spanish attacks, and perhaps the worst enemy of all, fear. When fear took root, unity collapsed. When trust died, so did the colony. So they ran, not together, but in scattered threads, some to the sea, some to the woods, all to silence. The mystery of Roanoke was no longer a disappearance, it was a warning, a parable written in vanishing ink. For centuries, it was treated as a curious footnote, but Roanoke is something deeper, a hidden origin story. Not because it lacked meaning, but because its voices were silenced by time, by nature, by neglect. Yet within that silence is a story of terror, yes, but also resilience, of people who risked everything to create a future, and who, in the end, made impossible choices. This is a story about survival and the cost of it, a story about cultures that collided and blurred, about memory, how fragile it is when no statues are raised, when no graves are marked, when the only monument is a single word, Croatan, carved into the bones of a dying dream. What makes this terrifying isn't that we didn't know, it's that we almost didn't ask. Centuries passed while the truth lay buried beneath trees, rivers, silence. But in 2025, science listened. DNA, radar, linguistic reconstructions, all aligned with the stories native voices had carried for generations. They weren't lost, we just stopped listening. And what we nearly lost wasn't just a colony. It was the will to remember, to connect forgotten footprints with the people who made them. Because if the first Americans to vanish could be erased this easily, who else have we forgotten? That is the true legacy of Roanoke, not the disappearance, but how quickly we let it go. What if they were never lost, just waiting to be found?